He was a combat engineer in Vietnam. Squatters refused to leave his land, so he rigged the perimeter. The motion sensor beeped 3 times, then went silent. Dex Rutherford stared at the small device in his weathered hands, confused. It should have detected the same movement for at least 30 seconds, but it had stopped after exactly 9 seconds. The pattern made no sense unless someone knew how military sensors worked. He looked across his Montana ranch toward the cluster of trailers and RVs that had appeared 6 months ago. Smoke rose from illegal campfires. Voices carried on the wind, but they sounded organized, coordinated. These weren't random drifters. Someone had trained them. 3 months after his father's unexpected heart attack, Dex had driven 8 hours from Billings to claim the family ranch, expecting peace and memories. The guilt of not visiting more often in his father's final years weighed heavily on his conscience. Instead, he found 17 trailers, 2 RVs, and a makeshift compound where his childhood barn had stood. A hand-painted sign declared, Kowalski Community Settlement, established rights under Montana adverse possession law. Marcus Kowalski, a sharp-faced man in expensive boots, had emerged from the largest trailer with legal papers and a cocky smile. He claimed 7 years of occupation gave his group squatters rights to the land. The dates on his documents seemed legitimate, but Dex knew his father had been checking the property regularly until his death. Someone was lying about the timeline. The county sheriff, Dale Morrison, had shrugged when Dex showed him the deed. Morrison claimed the adverse possession case was complicated, requiring expensive legal action that could take years. His response felt rehearsed, like he had given the same speech before. Elena Vasquez, the only attorney willing to take the case, discovered disturbing facts during her research. The county assessor's office showed no record of Kowalski's presence before 3 months ago, but mortgage companies had somehow been informed the land was under dispute. Bank records revealed mysterious payments flowing between shell companies connected to Kowalski and several local officials. Dex's military training kicked in as he studied the compound through binoculars. The trailers were arranged in a defensive pattern around the central area. Solar panels and water tanks suggested permanent settlement intentions. Security cameras pointed toward the access road, but none faced the eastern ridge where Dex now crouched. These people understood surveillance and perimeter defense. They were expecting legal challenges, maybe even law enforcement action. But they weren't expecting a combat engineer who had spent 2 years disarming Viet Cong tunnel systems and building defensive positions under enemy fire. As he watched, Kowalski emerged from his trailer and walked to the property line, staring directly toward Dex's position on the ridge. He raised a satellite phone to his ear and spoke for exactly 2 minutes before disappearing inside. Whoever Marcus Kowalski really was, he had connections, resources, and knowledge that went far beyond simple land grabbing. That evening, Dex drove to Elena's office in downtown Whitmore, a faded strip of businesses struggling against the economic reality of a dying ranch town. Elena Vasquez worked from a converted hair salon, law books stacked between hairdryer chairs that hadn't been moved since she bought the place 2 years earlier. Her desk sat buried under property records, court filings, and photographs of the disputed land. She looked exhausted as she poured coffee from a pot that had been brewing too long. Elena spread a county map across her desk, marking properties with red pins. 7 ranches surrounding Dex's land had faced similar adverse possession claims in the past 18 months. All involved the same pattern: legitimate-looking occupants, expensive legal documentation, and county officials who seemed reluctant to enforce property rights. 3 families had already lost their land after costly court battles. The remaining landowners had either sold cheaply or abandoned their properties entirely. Marcus Kowalski's background check revealed fragments that didn't connect properly. Public records showed him living in Denver until 2 years ago, working as a real estate consultant for companies that had since dissolved. His credit history was clean, almost artificially clean, as if someone had scrubbed away inconvenient details. The shell companies funding his operation traced back to a Nevada corporation owned by a blind trust. Elena had hit legal dead ends every direction she investigated. Dex studied the map, his engineer's mind seeing patterns Elena had missed. All 7 targeted properties sat along a potential corridor between existing highway access and a proposed natural gas pipeline route. Someone with advanced knowledge of the pipeline development could acquire land cheaply through forced sales, then sell to energy companies at massive profits. The adverse possession scam wasn't about settlement rights. It was about corporate land theft disguised as legal occupation. Elena leaned back in her chair, frustrated by months of blocked investigations. Local judges had family connections to the affected properties, creating conflicts of interest that slowed court proceedings. Sheriff Morrison claimed budget constraints prevented proper investigation of the adverse possession claims. The county assessor's office had suffered a convenient computer crash that destroyed recent property transaction records. Every official channel led to delay, confusion, or outright obstruction. As they talked, Dex noticed Elena checking her watch repeatedly. She explained that her car had been vandalized twice since taking his case. Strange men in pickup trucks had been photographing her office and following her home. Yesterday, someone had left a typed note under her door suggesting she focus on less controversial legal work. The pressure was coordinated, professional, and effective. Elena was scared, though she tried to hide it behind legal terminology and professional confidence. Dex understood the tactics being used against them. In Vietnam, psychological warfare often proved more effective than direct confrontation. Isolate the enemy, create doubt, apply pressure until they abandoned their position voluntarily. Kowalski's operation was using the same playbook against rural Montana landowners. But psychological warfare worked both ways. A combat engineer who had survived Tet Offensive could adapt those same techniques against corporate land grabbers. Walking to his truck, Dex noticed the same dark sedan that had been parked outside Elena's office when he arrived. As he drove toward his temporary motel room, the sedan followed at a careful distance, never getting close enough for him to see the license plate clearly. Someone wanted him to know he was being watched. Tomorrow, he would begin watching them back. The guilt of not protecting his father from this threat gnawed at his conscience, but he wouldn't make the same mistake twice. At dawn, Dex returned to his father's ranch carrying a backpack filled with equipment he had hoped never to use again. Decades after leaving Vietnam, muscle memory guided his movements as he established observation posts around the settlement's perimeter. The eastern ridge offered perfect concealment, while providing clear sight lines to the entire settlement. From this position, he could study the daily routines of Kowalski's people without being detected. Through military binoculars, Dex cataloged 17 adults and 3 teenagers living in the encampment. Their behavior patterns revealed careful organization that contradicted their claims of being simple squatters seeking adverse possession rights. Work details operated on precise schedules. Meals happened at coordinated times. Security shifts rotated every 4 hours with overlap periods for intelligence sharing. These people had training in small unit operations and perimeter security. Kowalski emerged from his trailer at exactly 6:30, conducting a radio check with positions around the settlement. The communications were brief, professional, using coded references that suggested operational security training. After completing his security sweep, Kowalski drove a black SUV toward town, following the same route and timing that Elena's surveillance notes had documented for the past 2 weeks. His movements were predictable, which meant they could be exploited. Dex used his father's hunting cabin as a forward operating base, positioning equipment and supplies for extended surveillance operations. The cabin sat 2 miles from the compound, connected by deer trails that avoided the main access road. Solar panels charged communication batteries. Rain barrels collected water for extended stays. Everything he needed to monitor the enemy without being discovered or dependent on outside resources. His father's workshop contained tools and materials that sparked ideas from his combat engineering days. Copper wire, batteries, small electric motors, and basic electronic components could be repurposed for surveillance and deterrent systems. Dex began sketching circuit diagrams for motion sensors, alert systems, and recording devices. Nothing lethal or dangerous, but effective enough to gather intelligence and create psychological pressure. The workshop also contained his father's personal papers, including correspondence that revealed disturbing information about the months before his death. Insurance companies had increased premiums on ranch property throughout the county, citing elevated risk assessments for rural land holdings. Property tax evaluations had been mysteriously delayed, creating financial pressure on elderly landowners. Anonymous offers to purchase land had arrived regularly, always below market value but promising quick cash sales. His father had documented strange vehicles crossing the property at night during his final months alive. Tire tracks near the old mine shaft suggested regular visits by people who knew the terrain well. Survey stakes had appeared and disappeared around the property boundaries. Someone had been planning the occupation while his father was still alive, waiting for the right moment to implement their scheme. As afternoon shadows lengthened, Dex observed a helicopter approaching the compound from the south. The aircraft landed briefly near Kowalski's trailer, discharged 2 passengers, and departed without shutting down engines. The entire operation lasted less than 5 minutes. Professional extraction teams used similar techniques for rapid insertion and withdrawal from hostile territory. Whoever was backing Kowalski had resources that went far beyond simple real estate speculation. That evening, Dex drove to the county courthouse to examine public records before the building closed. The clerk seemed nervous as she retrieved files related to property disputes in the area. Several documents had been misfiled or removed entirely. The remaining records showed a pattern of administrative confusion that always seemed to favor adverse possession claimants over legitimate property owners. Someone with access to official records was manipulating the legal system from the inside. The question that haunted him now was whether his father had discovered this corruption before his sudden death. The next morning, Dex began implementing Phase 1 of his defensive strategy. Using knowledge gained from tunnel warfare in Vietnam, he placed motion sensors at key points around the settlement's perimeter. The devices were designed to detect movement patterns and transmit data to receivers hidden in the forest. Each sensor was camouflaged using techniques he had learned disarming explosive devices in dense jungle terrain. The goal was intelligence gathering, not confrontation. He had sworn decades ago never to use his combat skills to harm another human being again. From his observation post, Dex watched Kowalski's security team conduct their morning patrol. They moved with military precision, checking predetermined positions and reporting findings through encrypted radios. Their search patterns revealed professional training in encirclement defense and counter-surveillance operations. These were not civilian squatters playing at being tough. Someone had deployed experienced personnel to hold this position against anticipated resistance. Dex's motion sensors began transmitting data that revealed disturbing patterns. Night movements around the compound followed routes that avoided the main trails, suggesting knowledge of the terrain that should have taken months to acquire. Supply runs occurred during specific time windows, when county sheriff patrols were scheduled elsewhere. Radio communications increased dramatically during business hours, coordinating with outside contacts about legal proceedings and local government activities. Elena called his satellite phone with urgent news from her courthouse research. Property records showed that Kowalski's Nevada Corporation had filed preliminary mining claims on 16 parcels throughout the county, including Dex's ranch. The filings were dated 3 weeks before his father's death, indicating advanced knowledge of when the land would become available for adverse possession claims. Someone with access to confidential health records or estate planning information had been feeding intelligence to the operation. The mining claims targeted specific geological formations that government surveys had identified as potentially valuable for rare earth mineral extraction. Recent environmental studies commissioned by the Department of Energy had marked these same areas as strategic resources for national security purposes. Kowalski wasn't just grabbing land for a gas pipeline. He was positioning himself to control access to materials critical for military and technology applications. Dex decided to escalate his psychological pressure campaign by targeting the compound's sense of security. Late that night, he used thermal imaging equipment to identify guard positions and patrol schedules. Moving through the forest with skills learned during night reconnaissance missions, he placed small speakers near the perimeter that would broadcast recordings of footsteps, radio static, and vehicle engines at random intervals. The sounds were subtle enough to avoid detection, but persistent enough to create doubt about perimeter security. His father's journal contained detailed maps of old mining tunnels that honeycombed the area beneath the compound. Most shafts had been sealed decades earlier, but several access points remained hidden in the forest. Dex realized the helicopter visits were likely connected to geological surveys being conducted through these underground passages. The operation was more sophisticated than simple land grabbing. They were conducting industrial espionage and resource theft under cover of legal property disputes. By dawn, reports from his motion sensors showed increased activity around the settlement. Guards were responding to false alarms triggered by his psychological warfare tactics. Radio chatter indicated growing paranoia about potential law enforcement surveillance or rival claim jumpers. Kowalski's people were beginning to understand they faced an opponent with capabilities they hadn't anticipated. But as Dex studied the transmission logs, one detail made his blood run cold. The helicopter's arrival time had coincided exactly with his father's last known radio check 3 months ago. 3 days of psychological pressure had achieved the desired effect. Kowalski's security detail was operating on reduced sleep, jumping at shadows, and making tactical errors that revealed their defensive weaknesses. Dex observed their patrols becoming sloppy, their radio discipline breaking down, and their confidence eroding. It was time to apply direct pressure through face-to-face confrontation. Dex approached the encampment's main entrance at midday, walking openly down the access road with his hands visible. His military bearing and calm demeanor immediately caught the attention of perimeter guards, who scrambled to alert their commander. Kowalski emerged from his trailer flanked by 2 men carrying concealed weapons, their body language suggesting professional security training rather than civilian protection. Kowalski maintained his friendly facade while his eyes assessed Dex for signs of weapons or recording devices. He offered coffee and conversation, playing the role of reasonable neighbor caught in unfortunate legal circumstances. His explanation of adverse possession rights sounded rehearsed, hitting legal talking points designed to discourage further resistance. But Dex noticed subtle tells that revealed Kowalski's military background, weapons awareness, tactical positioning, and communication patterns that suggested command experience. During their conversation, Dex dropped carefully chosen details about his combat engineering background and recent observations of helicopter activity near the old mining tunnels. Kowalski's reaction confirmed suspicions about the true nature of their operation. His casual questions about Dex's military service became more specific, probing for information about demolitions training and tunnel warfare experience. Someone had briefed Kowalski about the potential threat posed by a combat engineer. As they talked, Dex identified security cameras and communication equipment that exceeded anything legitimate squatters would require for simple property protection. Satellite internet dishes, encrypted radio systems, and thermal imaging devices revealed an operation with substantial funding and sophisticated intelligence requirements. This level of technology suggested backing from corporate or government sources with access to restricted equipment. Elena arrived unexpectedly, claiming she needed to serve legal papers related to their court filing. Her presence forced Kowalski to maintain his cooperative facade while she documented the compound's layout and photographed evidence of permanent structures being constructed on disputed land. Her legal training helped her ask questions that revealed inconsistencies in Kowalski's story about the timeline of occupation and development activities. After Elena left, Kowalski's demeanor shifted from friendly neighbor to calculating adversary. He warned Dex that continued interference with their settlement would result in criminal charges for harassment and trespassing. His threats carried the confidence of someone with connections to local law enforcement and political authorities. The conversation ended with Kowalski suggesting that selling the property would be much simpler than fighting a legal battle he couldn't win. That evening, Dex discovered that his motion sensors had been systematically located and disabled by someone with electronic countermeasures training. Professional sweep teams had identified his surveillance equipment and neutralized it without triggering alarms. Kowalski's people possessed capabilities that went far beyond basic security knowledge. They were dealing with an operation that had access to military-grade equipment and personnel. Dex realized the stakes were higher than simple land theft. The mineral rights, the sophisticated security, the government connections, and the professional personnel all pointed to something approaching a covert operation. His father had stumbled onto something much bigger than family property disputes. Now Dex faced opponents who wouldn't hesitate to use force if psychological pressure and legal manipulation failed to achieve their objectives. As he stared at the disabled sensors, a horrifying possibility crystallized in his mind. His father's sudden heart attack might not have been natural causes after all. Dex spent the next 48 hours implementing the strategy that would define the final phase of his campaign. His father's workshop contained everything needed to construct sophisticated early warning systems around the encampment's vulnerable access points. Using techniques learned from constructing defensive positions under enemy fire, he began rigging the perimeter with devices designed to create maximum psychological impact without causing physical harm to anyone. Elena called with devastating news from her investigation into his father's medical records. The coroner's report showed inconsistencies that should have triggered a more thorough investigation. His father's prescription medication had been changed 3 weeks before his death, switching to a heart medication that could cause dangerous interactions with his existing blood pressure pills. The prescribing doctor had no record of authorizing the change, and the pharmacy claimed the prescription came through an electronic system that showed signs of unauthorized access. Dex drove to the county medical examiner's office, where Elena had arranged a meeting with Dr. Sarah Chen, the deputy coroner who had handled his father's case. Dr. Chen explained that she had recommended a full autopsy based on the medication discrepancies, but her supervisor had overruled her decision, citing budget constraints and family wishes for quick burial. The supervisor had since retired and moved to another state, leaving no forwarding address. The prescription trail led to disturbing discoveries about the extent of the conspiracy. Electronic health records showed that several elderly ranchers in the area had received similar medication changes in the months before losing their land to adverse possession claims. The pattern suggested systematic targeting of property owners who posed obstacles to the mineral rights acquisition scheme. Someone with access to medical databases was identifying vulnerable targets and eliminating them through pharmaceutical manipulation. That night, Dex began installing the defensive systems that would justify the title of combat engineer. Motion-activated spotlights were positioned to illuminate specific approach routes while creating blind spots elsewhere. Audio devices were programmed to broadcast recorded conversations between Kowalski and his associates, conversations that Dex had captured using directional microphones during his surveillance operations. The recordings revealed discussions about timeline acceleration and elimination of remaining obstacles to their operation. His most sophisticated device was a network of seismic sensors placed along underground mining tunnels that could detect movement and trigger coordinated responses across multiple locations. When activated, the system would create the impression of coordinated activity throughout the area, while actually being controlled from his father's cabin. The psychological effect would be overwhelming for people who believed they were facing a single individual. Elena arrived at the cabin, carrying a briefcase filled with legal documents that would expose the entire conspiracy to federal authorities. Her research had uncovered shell companies connected to a defense contracting corporation that specialized in rare earth mineral extraction for military applications. The adverse possession scheme was a cover operation designed to acquire strategic resources without triggering national security reviews that would accompany legitimate mining operations. As they reviewed the evidence, Dex explained his defensive preparations and the timeline for implementation. Elena understood that legal channels had been compromised, leaving direct confrontation as the only option for stopping the operation. She agreed to coordinate with federal investigators, while Dex applied pressure that would force Kowalski's people into making mistakes that would expose their criminal activities. Just before dawn, Dex received a radio transmission on his father's emergency frequency. Kowalski's voice came through clearly, offering a final opportunity for negotiation before the situation escalated beyond peaceful resolution. The message included specific details about Dex's surveillance activities and defensive preparations, proving that their operation had capabilities that exceeded anything he had anticipated. Dex responded to Kowalski's radio transmission by activating the complete perimeter defense system he had spent 3 days constructing around the encampment. Motion sensors triggered spotlights that illuminated predetermined zones while leaving others in darkness. Audio speakers began broadcasting the recorded conversations between Kowalski and his associates, conversations that revealed their involvement in his father's death and the systematic elimination of other ranchers who had opposed their operation. The psychological impact was immediate and devastating. Kowalski's security details scrambled to respond to what appeared to be coordinated surveillance from multiple positions around their settlement. Radio communications became frantic as guards reported lights, sounds, and electronic interference that seemed to indicate they were surrounded by a much larger force than one retired combat engineer. The seismic sensors triggered coordinated responses that made their underground tunnel activities seem exposed and compromised. Elena had positioned herself at the county courthouse with federal investigators who were monitoring the situation through encrypted communications equipment. The recorded conversations being broadcast from Dex's perimeter devices provided evidence of conspiracy, murder, and federal crimes that would justify immediate intervention by law enforcement. Her legal strategy required Kowalski's people to take actions that would prove their criminal intent beyond reasonable doubt. Kowalski emerged from his trailer carrying military-grade communication equipment and began issuing orders to evacuate the encampment within 4 hours. The evacuation timeline suggested advanced preparation for emergency withdrawal, confirming that their operation had contingency plans for exposure or legal intervention. Vehicles began arriving from off-site locations, including trucks capable of carrying heavy equipment and personnel, who had not been visible during previous surveillance. Dex observed the evacuation activities from his father's cabin while monitoring radio frequencies used by the operation. Intelligence chatter revealed that Kowalski's superiors were terminating the Montana project due to security compromises and shifting resources to similar operations in Wyoming and Colorado. The conversation included specific references to eliminating evidence that could connect their organization to the deaths of local ranchers. As darkness fell, Dex detected movement near his father's gravesite, located on a hill overlooking the main ranch house. Thermal imaging revealed two figures digging near the headstone, apparently attempting to retrieve something that had been buried with his father. The discovery confirmed his worst suspicions about the circumstances of his father's death and the extent of the conspiracy to cover up their crimes. Elena's federal contacts confirmed that arrest warrants had been issued for Kowalski and 12 associates based on the evidence provided by the surveillance recordings. FBI tactical teams were en route to coordinate with local law enforcement for simultaneous raids on the encampment and related facilities throughout the region. The investigation had expanded to include similar operations in 4 western states, where defense contractors were suspected of using adverse possession schemes to acquire mineral rights. Kowalski's final radio transmission acknowledged defeat, but included a threat that chilled Dex to his core. The operation possessed detailed intelligence files on Elena, her family, and other individuals who had opposed their activities. Elimination of witnesses remained an option, even after the Montana project was terminated. The fight for his father's land had evolved into a battle for survival against an organization with resources and ruthlessness that extended far beyond simple corporate crime. Dex realized this wouldn't end with handcuffs and court proceedings. It would end only when someone decided he and Elena weren't worth the trouble anymore. The FBI tactical teams arrived at dawn, coordinating their assault with the psychological pressure created by Dex's perimeter defense system. Federal investigators had been tracking similar operations across 4 western states for 18 months, waiting for the evidence needed to connect the scattered incidents into a prosecutable conspiracy case. Spotlights continued illuminating the encampment, while recorded conversations provided real-time evidence of criminal conspiracy for the federal agents. Kowalski's security detail surrendered without resistance, overwhelmed by the coordinated law enforcement response and the electronic warfare tactics that had shattered their operational security. Kowalski himself was arrested while attempting to destroy evidence near the mining tunnel entrance. Federal agents recovered laptops containing detailed plans for mineral extraction operations across 7 western states, correspondence with defense contractors, and financial records proving the systematic murder of elderly ranchers who had opposed their land acquisition schemes. The evidence included medical records showing pharmaceutical manipulation designed to cause fatal heart attacks in targeted individuals. Elena's legal strategy had succeeded beyond expectations. The recorded conversations provided irrefutable evidence of conspiracy, murder, and federal crimes that would result in life sentences for Kowalski and his associates. Additional arrests were made simultaneously at related operations in Wyoming, Colorado, and Nevada, dismantling a network that had stolen millions of dollars in mineral rights through fraudulent adverse possession claims and targeted assassinations. Dr. Chen supervised the exhumation of Dex's father, whose body contained traces of cardiac medication that would have been lethal when combined with his prescribed blood pressure pills. The autopsy confirmed that his death resulted from pharmaceutical poisoning designed to simulate natural heart failure. Security camera footage recovered from Kowalski's equipment showed his associates accessing the ranch property and contaminating his father's medication supply 3 weeks before his death. Federal investigators discovered that the operation had been funded by a defense contracting corporation seeking to control rare earth mineral deposits required for military technology applications. The adverse possession scheme allowed them to acquire strategic resources without triggering national security reviews that would have exposed their illegal methods. Congressional hearings were announced to investigate the broader implications of corporate infiltration into rural land ownership disputes. Dex stood on his father's land as federal agents dismantled the last traces of Kowalski's encampment. The trailers and equipment were being loaded onto trucks for transport to evidence facilities, leaving behind only tire tracks and damaged ground that would heal with time. His perimeter defense system had achieved its purpose, forcing the enemy into mistakes that exposed their criminal activities to law enforcement intervention. Elena approached carrying legal documents that confirmed his undisputed ownership of the family ranch. All adverse possession claims had been declared fraudulent, and dismissed by federal court order. Insurance companies were required to restore original coverage terms, and the county assessor's office was under investigation for corruption. His father's legacy was secure, and justice had been served for the murdered ranchers throughout the region. 6 months later, Dex had restored the ranch to productive operation, raising cattle, and maintaining the land his father had protected until his death. The old mining tunnels were sealed permanently, and motion sensors around the property now served legitimate security purposes. He had found peace in the daily routines of ranch work, knowing that his combat engineering skills had served justice one final time. Elena visited regularly, having established a successful practice representing rural landowners against corporate exploitation. Together, they had created a legal defense network that protected family ranches from similar schemes. Dex's transformation from guilt-ridden son to determined defender of his father's memory was complete. Sometimes the war continues long after the last shot is fired, but justice has a way of finding those who refuse to surrender. Thank you for listening to our fictional Western story. Click the video on your screen to watch another thrilling tale from the modern American frontier. Don't forget to subscribe, and consider leaving a super chat to support us in bringing you more exciting stories from the contemporary West.